I guess he's known for being overly harsh when criticizing songs, albums, and artists. That's kind of like a shtick, which is fine. I understand exaggerating for entertainment purposes, but apparently that behavior got him into trouble recently due to a video he made all the way back in 2024.
And you actively make an album about it and talk about your own personal journey, and then out of nowhere, one of the most popular music reviewers of all time says, yeah, you're a little bit too dramatic about the cancer, thus undermining your struggle as a woman. Picture this for 1 second. I want you to imagine this, and then I want you to imagine he dies on this hill.
Anthony Fantano has been doing this longer than most people on YouTube have been old enough to watch it. He launched the needle drop in 2009, before algorithm culture, before viral discourse, before the term content creator even existed in its current form, and he built it on one simple and unforgiving premise. He would say exactly what he thought about music every single time, regardless of who made it or how much their fans loved them. He called himself the internet's busiest music nerd, and over 15 years he backed that title up with thousands of reviews, a massive and deeply loyal audience, and a reputation for being the one critic on YouTube who operated more like a traditional music journalist than a hype machine. You didn't go to Fantano's channel to feel good about your favorite album. You went there to find out what someone thought of it when they weren't trying to be polite about it. That identity, the honest, unfiltered critic, is both the thing that made him a genuinely important figure in music discourse and the thing that has put him in the middle of controversy more times than most people can count. He's feuded with Drake, with Logic, with Post Malone, with Grimes, with Ronnie Rad. He gave Kanye West's collaborative record with Ty Dolla $ign a review he described as essentially unrateable. He was sued by Activision over a TikTok audio clip about pizza slices. He's the kind of figure who seems to generate friction the way other people generate views, constantly, and seemingly without trying to slow down. But none of those moments quite prepared the internet for what happened in June 2026, because this time, the controversy didn't just involve a bad review. It involved a woman who had been going through chemotherapy, an interview with one of the biggest pop stars in the world, and a cultural flashpoint about whether a critic owes anything to the person they're reviewing beyond the music itself. The specific review at the center of everything was posted on October 29, 2024, nearly 2 full years before the moment things exploded. Halsey had released an album called The Great Impersonator, and it was unlike most things she'd put out before. It was written and recorded while she was undergoing chemotherapy, dealing with a diagnosis of systemic lupus and a rare T-cell lymphoproliferative disorder. The album was personal in a way that made it impossible to separate the art from the person making it, or at least that was how most people experienced it. Fantano gave it a 1 out of 10. He described the album as having what he called the worst case of main character syndrome he'd heard on any pop record that year, and said several tracks sounded like indulgent demos. Most of his audience moved on. Halsey's fans did not. So why did a review from 2024 blow up into one of the biggest music controversies of 2026? And what was the single thing Fantano posted on X that set the entire chain reaction off? Here's how it actually started. On June 21, 2026, a user on X posted something defending Halsey's album against Fantano's old review, pointing out that the discourse around the review had outlasted interest in the review itself. Fantano, seeing the post, quote-tweeted it with a comment suggesting that people were more interested in his review than the actual album. It was meant to be a dig, a cheeky way of pointing out the irony that the song and the artist he supposedly minimized were being used primarily as ammunition against him rather than celebrated on their own terms. It was the kind of comment that works perfectly in a low-stakes online discussion. It did not land that way. Halsey saw it, and Halsey responded directly, publicly, and without holding anything back. What Halsey wrote in response became one of the most widely shared celebrity social media moments of the year. She told Fantano that she was certain her least memorable song would be remembered more fondly, and for longer than anything he had ever done with his life. She said that everything he wrote was more whiny and edgy than anything she had put on the album. And then she added the line that stopped people mid-scroll, "But at least I had the excuse of going through chemo." It was a sentence that hit differently because it was factually true. She had been going through chemotherapy when she made the album. The personal cost of creating that record was not theoretical or metaphorical. And in one line, she connected Fantano's old review and his new snarky comment to something far more painful than musical disagreement. She continued the thread the following day, writing that a pay-for-clicks YouTuber pretending to be a professional critic had used the phrase main character syndrome to describe an artist who had lamented her own medical suffering on an album that was, in fact, about her own life. She called him a raised by 4chan edgelord bully. The internet absorbed all of it, divided itself immediately, and started arguing. Fantano did not go silent. He replied to Halsey's first post by calling her queen and saying he was flattered to be on her radar, a response that his supporters read as calm and confident and that his critics read as dismissive and condescending. He also posted separately that anyone acting like he was the most evil person alive for not liking an album was engaging in a performance in stupidity. He defended his review by saying it had nothing to do with Halsey's health struggles and everything to do with what he considered weak songwriting and poorly executed musical homages. He reminded his audience that he had championed the work of countless women artists over the years, and that refusing to give a favorable review to one album did not make him a misogynist. The defenses were coherent. The argument he was making was not unreasonable on its face. But the reason this didn't just blow over, was that the controversy wasn't only about the original review anymore, because something else was happening at the same time, something that turned a music criticism debate into a much larger question about whose side you're on, and it involved Olivia Rodrigo. In the same week that the Halsey discourse was reigniting on social media, something else landed publicly, an interview between Anthony Fantano and Olivia Rodrigo on The Needle Drop. Rodrigo had just released a new album called You Seem Pretty Sad for a Girl So in Love, which debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200 with 485,000 equivalent album units, the biggest solo debut of 2026 according to Luminate data. She was at arguably the highest commercial and critical peak of her career, and she chose, in the middle of that moment, to sit down for a warm, extended conversation with Anthony Fantano, where she engaged enthusiastically with his opinions and appeared to enjoy the conversation. Fantano gave her album an 8 out of 10, a notably generous score from a critic who had just given Halsey's record a 1. The timing was not subtle, the optics were not clean. The fan response to the Rodrigo interview has to be understood in the context of who Olivia Rodrigo has built herself to be publicly. She launched the Fund for Good initiative with her Guts tour in 2024, which partnered with organizations supporting reproductive rights and gender equity, channeling over $2 million to those causes. She has spoken openly about feminism and about advocating for women in spaces where they've historically been dismissed or diminished. She is, in other words, someone whose audience expects consistency between her values and her public actions. And sitting down for a friendly, collaborative interview with a critic who had just been publicly accused by Halsey of dismissing a woman's suffering as main character syndrome was not the kind of consistency her fans were looking for. One viral post noted that Halsey had previously sent Rodrigo a cake celebrating her debut. For fans framing it through the lens of solidarity, Rodrigo's silence was a betrayal. It is worth being fair to Rodrigo here, because the criticism directed at her carried with it some assumptions worth examining. Celebrity promotional schedules are often locked in months in advance. The interview with Fantano may well have been arranged long before this particular wave of Halsey discourse crested. Rodrigo is not obligated to police every professional she talks to based on ongoing online feuds. And there's also the question of whether it's reasonable to demand that a pop artist publicly take sides in a dispute between a music critic and another artist, especially when her relationship to that dispute is tangential. Rodrigo's defenders pointed to all of this, and those arguments weren't wrong. But the reason the criticism kept going is that this was never purely a scheduling problem in the eyes of the people making the argument. It was a question about what you're willing to put your name next to when someone in your community is being hurt, and whether it was already scheduled is an acceptable answer to that question. But here's where the story gets even more layered, because Fantano's history didn't start with Halsey. There was something from 2025 that resurfaced at exactly the wrong moment for him, and it complicated everything. In August 2025, Anthony Fantano posted a video that his audience had not been expecting. In it, he addressed footage that had resurfaced from his old secondary YouTube channel, thatistheplan, which he had long since deleted. The footage showed him using racial slurs, including the N-word and the F-slur. Fantano confirmed in the video that the clips were real. He said that early in his YouTube career, he had lax views about quoting slurs in what he described as a comedic or satirical context. He told his audience he was, in fact, sorry about this. He acknowledged that some people considered him a racist and bigoted person, a label he rejected while still taking responsibility for the specific conduct. He said he had grown and that his politics, which he described as left-leaning, citing his support for Bernie Sanders and Zoran Mamdani, were evidence of who he actually was as a person. It was not a perfect apology by anyone's standard, but it was a real one. He didn't deflect entirely or deny the footage. The problem with that apology, and the reason it came rushing back into focus during the Halsey controversy, is that apologies in the internet era don't exist in isolation. They become part of a record. When Halsey called Fantano a raised by 4chan edgelord bully, she wasn't necessarily referencing that apology video directly, but her fans were. They pointed to the 2017 Fader article that had originally accused him of promoting alt-right sentiments through his deleted channel. They pointed to the resurfaced slur footage, and they combined it with the Halsey review to construct a portrait of someone with a consistent pattern of behavior rather than a series of isolated incidents. Whether that portrait is fair or not is something reasonable people disagree about. But it is the portrait that circulated, and it is the context through which a large portion of the audience encountering this controversy for the first time understood Anthony Fantano. What makes this complicated is that Fantano's own defense of himself included a history of standing up for the same artists now being invoked against him. He pointed out that he had stood up for Doechii against what he described as misogynistic attacks from Adin Ross's fanbase. He had defended Megan Thee Stallion publicly after Tory Lanez shot her, at a point when many in the hip-hop media ecosystem chose not to take a clear side. These aren't small things. They are part of the record too. The version of Fantano that uses slurs in old videos and the version that stands up for black women artists in hostile spaces are both real. And the question of how to hold both of those things simultaneously is the kind of question the internet is usually not very good at sitting with. People tend to collapse complex figures into one consistent narrative, hero or villain, credible or not, and the collapse almost always loses something true about the actual person in the process. So what is this conversation actually about? Because the more you look at it, the more it becomes clear that the Fantano-Halsey feud is really a proxy war for something that goes way beyond one album review. At the surface level, the argument between Halsey and Anthony Fantano is about whether his 1 out of 10 review of The Great Impersonator was fair or cruel. But underneath that argument is a much older and more uncomfortable question. What does a critic owe the person they're reviewing, especially when the work that's being evaluated was created in circumstances of real and documented suffering? Fantano's position, which he stated clearly to Variety, is that criticism is about the music, the production, the songwriting, the execution, and not about the biography of the person who made it. This is a defensible critical philosophy. It's actually the dominant philosophy in serious music criticism. The idea that good intentions or painful circumstances should be factored into an aesthetic assessment is one that most working critics reject, because it collapses the distinction between empathy and critical evaluation. You can feel for someone and still think what they made was not successful as art, but Halsey's argument is not really that critics should grade on a curve for sick people. Her argument is more specific and more pointed. She said that calling a record about a woman's experience of illness, main character syndrome, does something particular. It reaches for a phrase that is culturally used to dismiss people, especially women, who talk about their own suffering too much or too loudly. Main character syndrome is not a neutral descriptor. It is loaded language that has been used, often online, to mock women who express their inner lives publicly, as if expressing an inner life publicly is inherently self-indulgent. When that specific language gets applied to an album made during chemotherapy, Halsey's claim is that the language itself carries a meaning beyond its musical intent, that it validates a culture of dismissing women's pain as performative, regardless of what the reviewer consciously intended. That is a harder argument to dismiss than I think you gave it the wrong score. The Olivia Rodrigo dimension adds one more layer that the discourse opened up, and that deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms. The question of whose platform you share and whose company you keep is, in a world built on influence and audience, a genuine ethical question. Rodrigo did not endorse everything Fantano has ever said or done by sitting for an interview with him. But influence culture has developed its own norms about platforming, and those norms hold that proximity carries meaning. By appearing warmly on Fantano's channel in the same week Halsey was publicly confronting him, Rodrigo gave her audience something to parse, and a lot of her audience parsed it as a sign that, when the test came, her feminism stopped at the boundary of her own promotional interests. That reading may be too harsh. But it's the reading that spread, and it's the reading that will follow both of them into whatever each of them does next. And the biggest question of all, one that nobody on either side of this seemed willing to ask out loud, is whether the way we talk about music criticism online has become something that has nothing to do with music at all. One of the most telling details in this entire story is a small, easily overlooked fact. Almost no one involved in the June 2026 controversy spent significant time actually discussing The Great Impersonator as an album. The music that Halsey made during one of the hardest periods of her life, the thing that started all of this, became the battlefield rather than the subject. The debate was about Fantano's character, about Rodrigo's feminism, about the ethics of online criticism, about the resurfaced slur footage, about who was on whose side. The album itself and what it meant and what it communicated about living through serious illness while still trying to make art largely disappeared from the conversation. That is what happens when discourse on social media replaces discourse about the thing the discourse is ostensibly about. The review becomes a weapon. The music becomes evidence, the people become symbols. This doesn't mean the concerns being raised were illegitimate, they weren't. The question of how critics use language, and whether that language carries cultural weight beyond its stated intent, is a real question that music journalism has been grappling with for decades. The question of what a celebrity owes the community she has built a brand around is a real question in an era when parasocial relationships between fans and artists have become the dominant emotional logic of the music industry. The question of whether someone's history of problematic conduct on one platform should define how their work on another platform gets received is a real question with no clean answer. All of these are worth having. The problem is that the way they were having them in this particular moment, through viral posts, pylons, hot takes, and a 24-hour cycle that moves on before anything is actually resolved, meant that none of them were really being had at all. They were being performed. Fantano, Halsey, and Olivia Rodrigo will all continue doing what they do. The controversy will fade the way online controversies always do, replaced by the next thing that demands everyone's attention simultaneously. But the questions it surfaced don't go away just because the trending topics moved on. Can a critic separate an artist's personal circumstances from their work, and should they? Does the language a critic uses carry responsibility beyond their intended meaning? What does it mean when a pop star's feminist values are tested not by a politician or a policy, but by a podcast interview? And is there a version of music discourse online that actually serves the music, that actually helps people understand what was made and why it matters, or has the discourse become a thing unto itself, fully detached from the art that technically gave it a reason to exist? Those questions don't have clean answers, but they're the right ones to be asking. And the fact that they're so difficult to sit with is exactly why this story keeps finding new ways to come back.